President, could you tell us how the tide is being turned in the case of the American hostages in Tehran?
Well, we haven't made adequate progress there. What we've done since the very beginning is to try to protect the lives and safety of those hostages from the original threats that they would be tried and executed, to build up on a worldwide basis support for our position, the condemnation of Iran, and the calling on the Iranian government to protect those hostages and to release them, and to have an adequate commitment in our own nation's military strength and otherwise, other strength, to protect those hostages and to expedite their release. If you remember early, we were fearful about their very lives because those threats to their safety and to their lives were made openly and publicly. We are facing a horrible example of international terrorism, the holding of innocent people as kidnapped victims, supported by and condoned by the government of Iran. And not only has our country and our allies condemned this action and now imposing multilateral economic sanctions against Iran, but the Muslim countries themselves, of whom Iran is a member, have recently called upon Iran to release the hostages and to resolve this crisis.
And yet the Iranian parliament is now saying that it may be late July before they even discuss the fate of the hostages.
My hope and my prayer is that they will be released very soon, but I cannot predict that.
Do you still consider it a crisis, Mr. President? I notice, looking through transcripts, that some months ago, every time you had visitors to the White House, you mentioned the subject and brought it up yourself. Now it seems to me you mention it somewhat less, or volunteer the subject somewhat less. Is it still a crisis? Should we still be saying on the air every day, day 100 and 200 or whatever it is?
Yes.
Should we still be flying flags at half-mast, tying yellow ribbons? Is it still a crisis, in
It's
other
still
words?
a crisis.
Why don't you talk
There
about
is
it?
never any time in my day's work that I'm not aware of the fact that 53 American hostages are being held as an act of international terrorism by the people, government, and the terrorists in Iran. We have mounted military force placement, primarily naval forces, in the Indian Ocean and in the Persian Gulf region. We have made a rescue attempt, which unfortunately was not successful, hopefully to get the hostages out. But in its failure even, it showed the determination that we have to protect those 53 hostages. And in addition to our own nation's unilateral actions and economic sanctions, we have now induced our allies to impose economic sanctions as well. I don't believe anyone who's in a responsible position in Iran don't agree that Iran is suffering economically and politically and diplomatically by the holding of these hostages. Those pressures, although they have not yet been successful, must be maintained. And one of the ways to maintain that pressure is to let the world be reminded every day that the hostages are being held.
But, sir, haven't you sort of changed the signal yourself by coming out of the White House and starting to campaign after saying for so long that you couldn't because of Iran?
Well, to some degree, the circumstances have changed, and to some degree, the emphases must be changed. After the unsuccessful rescue operation, it became then better for us to concentrate on a broad-based international economic pressure to be exerted against Iran. As a result of that effort, the European allies have now imposed economic sanctions against Iran. A major step, I would rather they be much more severe. In their minds, they are adequate. We can't control those allies, they're independent nations, but they have taken a major step in additional economic sanctions against Iran above and beyond what Iran has had to experience in the past. We hope that all these efforts collectively will be successful in protecting the lives of our hostages, and at the earliest possible moment, I pray that they'll be released, but I cannot predict the date.
Yet they continue to talk of placing the hostages on trial. Will the administration tolerate those people being put on trial in Iran?
The third week in November, I think it was the 20th, we issued a statement that still prevails, in effect prescribing what actions our nation would reserve as options if the hostages are tried or abused in any way. Those actions would be very severe against Iran. We have not closed any option for our nation to exercise, but for me to spell it in detail what we would do, I think would be inappropriate.